أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت وهو على كل شيء قدير. After I thank and praise the Creator of the universe, the Almighty, the Master and Controller of all affairs, the kind and merciful One, I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship except Him, and that the Prophet Muhammad is the final in a long series of messengers sent by Him to guide humanity. I greet you, Assalamu alaikum, may peace be on you, friends, family, and strangers may be watching this on YouTube. So, what I want to do in this discussion is it may end up being quite a lengthy discussion, but there's a need for my close friends and family who are not perhaps aware of it to understand the context, the background, the origins of the modern entity called the State of Israel, and to understand the place of this entity in history and the purpose of this, and to also find maybe ways of relating it to our holy text, and to develop an understanding and an orientation towards this important phenomenon. So that is the aim of what I want to deal with in this discussion. Now, let me start out by saying that you all are aware that there is a country called Israel. It's located in the heart of the Arab world. There's a conflict between the Palestinians and the Jewish population of Israel. And so those things, I'm not telling you anything new. And you might have, if you're a Muslim, you might have a close affinity for the Palestinians, who are often regarded as Muslim, but in fact are a Muslim-Christian mix of people. And but as Muslims, you look at them, you see the dress, you see the appearance, and they appear, you find sort of affinity or more of a connection with them. But that's not enough. To have a cultural and a ethnic feeling of brotherliness or fraternity with another people is not enough. It's not a basis on which to build a solidarity. From Quran, we know that solidarity is based on the intellectual and behavioral orientation of a people. So it is our intellectual and our behavioral stance in this planet, in this world, that determines whether we seek solidarity with the next person or the next nation. And so if somebody's behavior is oppressive and harmful and destructive, and it is born from a belief system or from an ideology or from a culture that is by and large destructive and negative, then we cannot form solidarity with that. And so let me first take you away from the form of cultural solidarity that people are preaching for with regard to the Palestinians and Israel, and put forward for you that any solidarity has to be a solidarity based in ideology. In other words, ideals, beliefs, practices. So let's continue the discussion. Let me first of all bring you a historical perspective on it. The first important aspect that I need to relate to you from history is the idea of nationalism. Now, if you're a younger person born, in the last 30 years or so, then you might not really have come to grips with the concept of nationalism. And nationalism to you is just another word. It's a natural occurring phenomenon. It is something which comes natural to humanity, and we are all nationalistic in some or other way. But let me elucidate a little bit on this word nationalism. The world has not always been national. Nationalism, first let me come to a definition. The word nationalism refers to a phenomenon where a people with particular nation characteristics, in other words, a particular language, a particular culture, a shared history, where they together decide to form a sovereign piece of land. So together, this nation decides, or the concept of nationalism states that the basis of national sovereignty or territorial sovereignty is the nation state. So people who share a common heritage, a common history, a common culture, a common language, etc., 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 in the understanding of nationalism are supposed to establish a sovereign piece of territory. And so, let me tell you also that the concept is not an old concept. It's a concept that emanates from the 1800s, right? The 1800s and the 1900s. And the concept was born really with the French Revolution, the Great French Revolution in Europe. Now, the French Revolution took place in 1789. So, in other words, very close to the 19th century, almost here at the point of the 1800s. But another important revolution also took place around that same time, 10 years earlier, and that is the American Revolution, also founded on nationalism, right? So, before, and really the American Revolution is really the place, the origin of the concept nationalism. It was in America where the idea of becoming an independent nation based on a shared history of the founding pilgrims of North America, based on their shared origins, found very practical usefulness for forming a new country, not connected to Britain as it was at that point, or not connected to France as some of it was at that time, or not, but connected to its own history and its own heritage. And so America was really the first country that was founded on the idea of nationalism, a new nation, a new territory, jurisdiction, a complete control over its own territory with no accountability to any outside power. So that was the American Revolution. And the French Revolution, 10 years later, is more or less uses some of the same principles. So some of the leaders within, some of the main thinkers within the French Revolution, like Rousseau and some of the others which escape me now, they incorporated many of the ideas of American nationalism into French nationalism. And that revolution came about and incorporated many of the ideas of the French people having a French history, having to be in control of France. And so the idea of nationalism became implanted in Europe via the French Revolution. Now you must recall, before the idea of nationalism was there were really no countries based on nation status. Europe, for example, consisted of 3 or 4 empires, and these empires were spread across many nations. Like you would get the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which incorporated countries like Hungary, like Austria, parts of Italy, parts of Germany. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire, stretching massively large across Europe, was in no way based on any particular nation. It was an empire. If you want to really get a current day example of an empire that does not or a country that is not nation-based, then you look at Russia. You see, Russia is a vast country that incorporates the Slavic people, the Russian people, but it also includes the people of, the Far East, and those are Eastern people. It incorporates the people of the Caucasus, which are different types of people in Chechnya and in those areas. So it includes the nation of the Tatars, which is also a nation on its own. So modern day Russia really does still reflect an 1800s empire before the French Revolution. Of course, you had other empires also operating. You had the Ottoman Empire, which also covered vast tracts of Europe, pieces of Eastern Europe, Arab parts of Arabia, North Africa, and so the same with a country or an empire. We called them empires at in those days, because they really stretched across many nations. But nationalism came about when there was a fragmentation of these empires. The Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in the main section of Europe, maybe you could say the Holy Roman Empire, which was it is now a defunct empire, but which covered the northern part of Europe, Germany, etc. And so the Holy Roman Empire was also an empire which was probably the first one to disintegrate. So nationalism emerged in the 1800s, late end of 1700s, 1800s. And when I say the 1800s, I mean it actually the 19th century as a whole, not the year 1801 to 1809. So I mean, when I use the word 1800s, let me just clarify, I mean the 19th century, the full 1800s. But it's often confusing when you say the 19th century, the 1900s come to mind. And so I'll make it easier, mentally just to fathom. So in the 1800s, there was a fragmentation of the vast empires of Europe, and countries decided that they would wish to re-establish themselves on the basis of the nation state. And so France became a nation state. Germany slowly became a nation state, and the most powerful nation state in the 1800s, probably on mainland Europe. By 1850, 1860, Germany had reunified and become probably one of the most powerful states in Europe. And so you had all these other small countries, like Britain also was affected by nationalism. But Britain remained an empire, and the British Empire incorporated vast, far-flung colonies. So the far-flung colonies, such as, for example, the Cape, where I'm speaking to you from, were members of the Grand British Empire, which was not a terrestrial or a land empire, but was more of an oceanic empire. So its empire was stretched across the oceans and across the continents. And so nationalism emerges in the 1800s. So what happens is, in the 1800s, as nations form themselves and seek what is called self-determination, in other words, territorial independence, sovereignty over their own territories, there's a people in Europe that does not fit in neatly. So in all the main cities of Europe, for example, in France and in Britain and in the eastern part of Europe, mainly in today's Ukraine, there's what is called the Israelites, or the ancient Hebrews, a people that had migrated hundreds of years before into Europe, that had found refuge in Europe, and really go back to Roman times, in fact, I believe, or actually not some of them, but not all of them. So, but let's leave that quickly, that piece of history. Let us just, for now, let me just explain to you that there's a people, the Hebrews, the Hebrew people, who are scattered and form a small component of all major countries in Europe. So, for example, in Warsaw, Poland, in Germany, in some of the main cities, in maybe Hesse, Kassel, in the main cities there of those provinces, and all over Europe, also in London, you get small pockets of Hebrew Jewish communities. But Europe being stooped in anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism still at that point in history, really do not engage or mix with the Hebrew people, with the Jewish people. In fact, why am I not using the word Jewish? You see, the word Jew or Jewish or Judaism is really not an ancient term. It's a fairly modern term. And yes, there was the tribe of Judah, but modern Jews are not just members of the tribe of Judah, a sub-component of the greater Israelite people. So just bear with me, I'm using a different term, the Hebrew people or the Israelites and so on. So what happens is that these people are living within ghettos. Now what to do with them? Because they are not speaking German like the Germans. They don't share the history of the German people. They are not really, they don't look like Germans. They dress differently. You know, they have certain personal traits in their appearance, like growing their whiskers very long. The attire, you know, the dress code is different. And of course, too many differences to really make them feel part of the German nation. The same with in France. And as Napoleon Bonaparte takes control of France at the end of the 1700s, he realizes that there are these people. And what he does is, during the madness of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and in seeking to get support from all sectors of European society, because Napoleon was not just a great military leader, he was also a great political strategist. He then starts opening the ghettos, because that is where the Hebrew people really stayed. They were locked up in ghettos, kept separately from the rest of Europe. And Europe by that time had been fairly prosperous. You know, economically, Europe had been the continent at the helm of world affairs for a few hundred years now, since about 1500. So in 1800, Europe was already dominant. It was already the dominant power. You know, they switched between Netherlands, Holland, Spain, Britain, and all of these countries had an opportunity to be at the helm of world affairs. And so Napoleon really opened the ghettos where the Israelite people were left. And Napoleon, being a humanist, or a person who declared or professed to be cultural, and being a liberator of humans in general, using the teachings of Voltaire there. Those names are getting to me: Voltaire, Montesquieu, and some of the French thinkers that preceded the revolution, whose thoughts really influenced the revolution. He then elevated human rights, or the rights of the Hebrew people, to a level where he liberated them from the ghettos of Europe. And so there were probably more than 1 million or several million of these Hebrew people in Europe. The problem is, as the 1800s progressed, the Hebrew people became very, very, very powerful in Europe. The Hebrew people, actually, after being liberated from the ghettos, became exceptionally powerful. Now, I want to use a modern day comparison. You know, you have, for example, in South Africa, in our country, we have a nation or a group here, an immigrant population of people emanating from the Horn of Africa. And we're all aware of it for the past 20, 30 years, since 1994. Because of the war and the upheaval in Somalia, a lot of the Somalian people have come to South Africa, and probably 2 million of them are in South Africa, just my own rough guess. And we have seen an extraordinary financial and economic propulsion and advancement of the Somali people. Why? Because of this extreme desperation and their sincere desire to escape the pain and suffering. Their efforts and their work just went far beyond what a general South African person would be capable of. And so the Somalis now started out as operating small little shops, and now the Somalis are really operating massive wholesalers and operations, and really are powerful. In fact, in Cape Town, if you go to Somali Town, you'll be surprised to see how expanded and how professional the Somali business operations have grown to. So in Europe, more or less the same took place in the 1800s, is that the Jewish or the Hebrew population who had been locked up in these ghettos, treated in a very inhuman or unfair way, emerged from there very, very successfully. Particularly, the field in which they excelled was in the field of banking. Because Europeans generally were very, very constrained and fettered by their Christian religious beliefs, which remained strong. And being a nation unfettered by Christian cultural practices and beliefs enabled them to enter business fields such as finance, and especially the field of money lending. Now, in Germany, there were several ghettos where these Hebrew people were operating and were establishing their fledgling money lending operations. And there was one family called the Rothschild, or the Red. I'm trying to recall what does the word Rothschild really mean. Emanated from Frankfurt in Germany. And look at this. Here's a little Wikipedia article on who Rothschild is. So let's just look at it, and just to bring you into the idea of the Rothschild family. And so what it says here, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, 23rd, the word Rothschild means red shield, because they, as a new banking operation, they used to use the red shield as their logo, the insignia. Meyer Amschel Rothschild, have a look at this. February 1744, also spelled was a successful banker and the founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty. Referring to his founding father of the international finance, Rothschild was ranked 7 on the Forbes magazine. Early life, Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744 in Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt, Holy Roman Empire, now Germany, one of 8 children of Amschel Moses Rothschild and his wife Schonsche Rothschild. Right? So there's a picture of the man. I don't know if it's possible to see that picture. So what we're saying is that, let me continue with our discussion. I just wanted to put you in context there. Is that the Rothschild family represents one and probably the leading family that escapes poverty by indulging or engaging in money lending for interest. Interest being a practice frowned upon or discouraged or even banned by Christians in Europe. And so, being unfettered by the traditional restrictions brought about by Christianity in Europe, the Jewish population excels, and especially this particular family. And they acquire or amass considerable wealth. And by considerable wealth, I mean really, in today's terms, millions and millions, and even up to billions of dollars in gold. To the point where the leaders, the political leaders, which in those days were really royal leaders or nobility, where they in fact had to send a visitor or an envoy to the Rothschild family when they needed to acquire horses for battle, cannons for battle, So if the Germans had to go, there were many wars early in the 1800s, in fact, called the Napoleonic Wars. And the Germans would often engage in war against France. And then France also engaged in war against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so these empires were all basically in the century where they slowly fragmented. And when they needed supplies, horses, ammunition, cannons, to pay the soldiers, they needed money. And soldiers want to be paid in real money. You can't print fake money and give it to soldiers. They want to be paid in something that is connected to gold or to silver. And the Rothschilds, of course, had a massive stash of gold and silver. And so they would advance money to the mini kings or princes in Germany, who at that stage was not a real full Germany yet. And they would extract interest from the government itself. And when they started lending money to the governments, in other words, to the little kings and princes who commanded the little army, because Europe at that point was really an empire, consisted of empires with little, military warlords running different provinces, and they would call these maybe the Duchy of Poland, or the Duchy of, with a duchess or a duke, which is basically a warlord running a particular section within the empire and providing men, and armor and whatever tools for war. So they were very active in forwarding, advancing cash to these little dukes and princes and components of all these empires, including to Napoleon. Napoleon, in fact, also had to borrow money from the Rothschilds, and as well as England, who also fought wars with France. So, okay, what do we have? Let me just quickly summarize. We have the phenomenon of nationalism, born with the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Empires fragmenting, scattering, where nations within empires, like the Polish nation within the greater Holy Roman Empire, wanting to become its own nation, or where, let's say, the Arab lands, like Saudi Arabia, wanting to become their own Arabia within the Ottoman Empire, or pieces of France, like maybe let's say parts of Spain, which was always kind of under French control or French domination, wanted to become its own country. So countries wanted self-determination based on their own nation, and that phenomenon emerged in the 1800s. Parallel phenomenon is the emergence of the powerful Jewish banking establishment. Some detached from traditional Christian values and principles, and really driven by its own cultural heritage, which is based on the Talmudic Judaism, the Torah, and a long 4,000-year Jewish history, which is well recorded within the Talmud and the holy books. Detached from commitment or national affiliations or national allegiances to the German nation or the French or the British. It's a little nation within many nations, but also emerging as an extremely powerful nation because of the growth of its elite, its own banking elite. Because the Rothschilds might have been, the Rothschild banking dynasty might have been established in Frankfurt, but very, very soon the sons, and he had several sons, I think 4 or 5 sons, very soon the sons of the father, Amschel Meyer Rothschild, resettled in the more distant European capitals such as London, Paris, I believe Venice or Rome. You see, so the sons of Meyer Amschel Rothschild resettled in the capitals of Europe, where they then could emerge as a transnational banking establishment. So in other words, I, as a brother Rothschild in England, could via messengers telegraph or send a message to my brother in Paris that, listen, give that guy $1 million franc or whatever monetary unit, and I'm good for, I'll be good for the money, and so you could for the first time transfer currencies across borders. So somebody will lodge his money with me in London, travel to Paris, and my brother Rothschild would pay him out the money there, and I would at some point in time make good on that $1 million franc whatever. So in other words, the conversion of currency became possible across nation states and across borders of the empires. So let me progress a little. I think I've set the scene for you. The Rothschilds becoming a massively powerful family in Europe, powerful than some governments in fact, because what they did was actually lend money to governments. So let me then progress the story a little bit further on. You see, as the 1800s progressed, the empires crumbled. The Holy Roman Empire crumbled. The Austro-Hungarian Empire crumbled. The French Empire crumbled. And by 1815, the French, what was the most powerful country in Europe, France, in 1815, that country was brought to its knees by England. So England, or the British Empire, emerged as the victorious power. The greatest battle in the 1800s took place. In fact, a series of battles took place between 1800 and 1815, and it culminated in the Battle of Waterloo. Now, Waterloo is not on water, it's not on the sea. Waterloo is a town or a small place, a village somewhere in modern-day Belgium. And that it is there that the armies of Great Britain collided with the army of France. It was the final stand. It was the greatest war of the 1800s. It shaped the future of Europe throughout the century, throughout that century. At that battle, Britain almost lost, but it was the intervening of Germany, of a German army, that actually turned the battle against Britain. Let me just tell you one fact about this battle at Waterloo, this great Battle of Waterloo, is that at that point the Rothschild families were very firmly entrenched on both sides. So there was a Rothschild bank in Britain and there was a Rothschild bank in France and in Germany. And they were funding the British on the one side, and the other brother from Germany, the other Rothschild brother from France, were funding the French side. So they were funding both sides and making huge returns, because all that money that they forwarded, they received back with interest. And so they became super rich out of the Napoleonic Wars, and especially out of Waterloo. But there was one event that actually catapulted the Rothschilds of England many fold over. And that was the scoop that the Rothschild brother in England made on bonds. You see, in England, the state would sell bonds, and those bonds would be money that you basically forward or lend to the English royal family or to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So the way that the Chancellor of the Exchequer makes money is it gives you a bond, and it promises you a massive return on investment on that bond, and those bonds are sold at any time. what happened in England is that the Rothschild brother within England, Nathan, I think Nathan was his name, Nathan Rothschild, he circulated a message from the battlefront across the ocean, across the water in Belgium, that the English was losing the war. He circulated a message in England that the English were busy losing the war. Maybe it was truth, maybe he was creating a lie. At one stage, the English was actually losing the war. And of course, the bonds which the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which the British royal family was trying to sell, dropped to almost zero. So those bonds, the value of the English bonds dropped to near zero. And Nathan Rothschild was in a position to acquire massive amounts of these bonds. I don't know today, maybe even half of it, or maybe 3/4 of it, acquire those bonds. And of course, when news came, in fact, later on in the day, in the evening, that the English had actually won the war at Waterloo, those bonds skyrocketed again. But what was the difference now? The difference was that massive acquisition of wealth in England by Nathan Rothschild, by the family. Massive acquisition, a massive scoop of the wealth of England took place. Now, listen, you can criticize me maybe on some of the details that I'm offering you here today, but please, you can do your research. What I'm telling you here is not fabricated nonsense. I'm telling you the actual history, and I'm going to give you a very, very good, solid understanding of the state of Israel. Anyway, I'm going to fast forward right now. So, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain became the paramount empire in Europe and across the world, the Rothschilds had also been elevated to the paramount banking family of the world. They were the economic superpower of the 1800s. So although they were not part of the English royal family, they were an independent family, their leverage, their power, their influence were unrivaled in history. You see, because they sat with the wealth, they sat with the money, and with money comes influence, power. You could buy politicians, you could buy lords. In fact, if you can bail out a lord who's in trouble and pay for you, get his castle, his sorted out, you could in fact own massive tracts of the English society. And that was the situation in England during the entire Victorian age. Because the Victorian age starts around about 1820, I'm not exactly sure, when Queen Victoria ascends to the throne, but it lasts all the way through the 1800s, 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And the English Royal British Empire ruling half of the world, not America anymore. Remember, America became independent, but still being economically connected to England. And there was a war with America in 1812 again, so still the most powerful country with the most powerful banking family located within its borders. Then grew. By 1914, the almighty British Empire had acquired a rival in Europe in the form of Germany. Because Germany, through the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, had reconstituted itself as a new nation, as a German nation, and had very, very effectively employed this idea of nationalism, because the German people indeed shared an ancient history. Remember, the German people, Germany is a very ancient term. It goes back to the Alemanni tribes, the tribes who confronted Rome very successfully, and who in fact brought Rome to its knees eventually. I'm talking about Western Rome. And the Alemanni tribes, or the Germanic people, had a very solid and proud history. And had in fact established himself through nationalism, through the idea of nationalism as the most powerful force in Europe, far surpassing what France used to be early on when they fought under Napoleon's leadership. And so Germany now is the rival. And so you have Germany now under the the phenomenon of nationalism being catapulted as a massive force in Europe, economically and militarily, with the powerful Rothschild family being very, very active within Frankfurt, Europe, in Europe in general. And you have a powerful France, powerful Britain. And so the table was set for a major confrontation between these two powerful countries. Now, I'm not going to be a conspiracy theorist here, but what I want to tell you is that the Rothschild family always used to profit from wars, because wars used to force the leaders or the kings to borrow money. And the Rothschilds were always ready to borrow money to governments, because if you borrow money to a government, you are guaranteed a repayment, unless that government is overthrown. But as long as you can keep that government in power, you will make more profits on lending money to a government than lending money to a private individual. So the rivalry between Britain and Germany eventually culminated in the First World War. The war that started between Germany and parts of the Russian Empire, which was really, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Also, nationalism being at the heart of the problem, in that case, Serbian nationalism, and the troubles in the Balkans, where these Baltic people, the people of the Balkans sought independence and their own country. The First World War broke out. And the First World War, we all know who won the First World War. You see, the First World War was won by Britain. But why did Britain win the First World War? Britain won the First World War simply because America joined the British side in the war and defeated Germany. Now, I'm not going to make a long story of this, but in fact, it's already a long story, but you can play this and continue listening to this, but you really need this background to the state of Israel. So in that war, the first massive world war that involved most of Europe, really, they call it a world war, but it was really Europe. It was not really South America wasn't involved. South Africa wasn't involved. Maybe there were some skirmishes in Namibia between Germans and British soldiers, but the First World War was really the first European war. It was the European theater that was the big one. There were opportunistic battles in the Far East. I think Japan was at that point still on the side of Britain, but there was no war in Australia, so it was really a European First World War. And really, the Rothschild family is really the family that are the kingmakers in this war. In the First World War, the decision, the victor, the side who won the war was pretty much decided by the Rothschild family. The Rothschild family, if it was not for them, they would not get, the Americans involved on the side of Britain, because America was completely apathetic to Britain. Remember, they hated Britain. Britain was a country that was their colonial power 100 years earlier. And they had no trouble abandoning Britain and allowing Germany to win that war. But it was the Rothschilds who really decided to get America involved. By that time, the Rothschild wealth and influence had spread very, very much to New York. And they were very, very much in control of finances and banking in New York also. Because remember, all American wealth are really European wealth, the aristocracy of America, really the European aristocracy that really set up shop in New York and in New England, which is the old America around today's, Boston and New York and those that old 13 colonies on the eastern shore of North America. So the Rothschilds, how did they get involved? They basically had an agreement with the English government. And that is that agreement with the English government that seals the war in their favor. And I want to talk to you about the Balfour Declaration. You see, the Balfour Declaration is the declaration that sets the scene for the West. Let me call it the West, which in fact when I refer to the West, I refer to the Anglo-Saxon world, the British/American English-speaking world. That sets the scene for them taking control of the world. Now, the Balfour Declaration. What is the Balfour Declaration? You see, the big family, Rothschild family in Europe, they sense that they also under the influence of nationalism. In fact, many of the Jewish people of Europe are wondering, look, everyone has a nation now. The Polish people have a nation, the British people, the Belgian people, every nation is a nation. What are we? And so they then reflect on what is our heritage, what is our history, what is our language, what is our common heritage. And they go back to the Israelites, the history of the Israelites. And they go back to the idea of, listen, we are a nation. We're a very ancient nation. In fact, the Bible speaks about us going back 4,000 years from the time of Abram and the time of Moses, etc. And they realized that as a nation, they could re-establish themselves also in a country. And, and they could also re-establish the ancient nation state of Israel or Judah, because there were these ancient states ruled by King Solomon, who established the kingdom of Israel. And they believe that, listen, Germany is a nation, France is a nation now, Poland is a nation. Why don't we reestablish the ancient kingdom of Israel? And the Rothschilds observed these tendencies within the Jewish community, and the young Zionists, who were the driving force of these new nationalistic ideas within the Jewish community scattered throughout Europe. The Zionists, they were called Zionists at that time. They were really not. And so the Balfour Declaration is an agreement or an undertaking by the government of England under pressure or under duress when they are facing defeat by the Germans, because in the trenches of Northern Europe they were not winning the war in the First World War, and they are in the process of losing, and losing against Germany means losing the empire, because Germany would then continue to march across the English Channel and eliminate or liquidate English power, because the Americans didn't really care. And so the Balfour Declaration is an agreement where England will get their American brothers and friends, the rich billionaires of America, to get the American people committed to the war. Now let's look at this Balfour Declaration. This is the Balfour Declaration, right? And what does it say? It says, dear, it's dated Foreign Office, addressed to the Foreign Office of England, or dated November 2nd, at the time when England was busy losing the war. Dear, because the war really was won after 1917. So the English the English a member of the English government writes a letter and says, dear Lord Rothschild. At that time they became lords now. They were just moneylenders. 100 years earlier they are now lords. I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government, and here comes the declaration. This is the Balfour Declaration. Here we go. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other countries. It should be grateful if you could bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So that is the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration is issued in 1917, November the 2nd, 1917, when Britain is still facing defeat against Germany. But with this declaration, which in fact commits the British government now to the creation, because at this point in time, for those of you who are not aware, that there's no Israel. Israel only came into existence in 1948. So this is many years before Israel. This is 30 years before Israel was created. But 30 years before the creation of Israel, during that war, the rich, powerful banking family, the Rothschild family, is given a promise. Now, this is a promise from a government to a private family. Dear Lord Rothschild, he's a family, he's a banker. He's the Bill Gates of his time. he's the one of the rich boys of his time. In fact, Bill Gates is a little mini of what Rothschild really is. You can't even compare the wealth of the Rothschilds with a guy like Bill Gates. But the government promises to a private banker that they will be sympathetic to their demands to get a piece of Palestine. And although they promise here that they would not harm the interests of the local Palestinian people, we all know how that turned out. Today there is no Palestinian land, we know that. So this promise to the most powerful economic power, the powerful Rothschild family, this promise, this note that you see here, is the note that seals the war in favor of Britain. Because what happens now is that the Rothschild family puts its machinery into action, because they don't own the banks only now. No, long time not. They own the banks, but they also own the main newspapers in America. And by owning the newspapers, it means you own the narrative. And you can now project the story of the First World War in British perspective, in British terms. And you become a party now to the conflict. And you're joining a side now. And you focus all your material, all your articles, all your perspectives in your hundreds of newspapers across America against Germany. And Germany now is demonized in the American press. There was no TV that time. I think there might have been radio, I'm not sure. But whatever media formats they had, they mobilized it to benefit England and to project a negative image of Germany. And so much so that there was some grand event that took place which really drew America into the battle on the side of Britain. You see, what I don't want you to take away from this is that the Balfour Declaration actually turned, the Balfour Declaration was one aspect in an ongoing negotiations between the powerful banking family, the Rothschilds, and the British establishment. And they had already given certain undertakings, but these undertakings were verbal, and the Rothschilds had already gotten the Americans to technically join the war earlier in 1917. But really, the commitment and the enthusiasm that was required something in writing. And so the verbal promises, because these things are not generally done in writing, you see, you can, verbal promises, and we know most recently that Russia secured promises from America that it would never expand NATO, and those verbal promises were just broken. So the Zionists of Europe were very clever. They heard from England, yes, we'll help you get a country, a state, help us, create propaganda in our favor through your media establishments, through your newspaper networks in America. But they actually, in November, it culminated in the Balfour Declaration, where they actually wanted a physical document so that the British could not claim. The British were very capable of deceiving and lying and making them promises of giving them Palestine and then reneging on that promise. So they secured something in writing and they published it. And when they got this Balfour Declaration, they really went all out. Then they got America in full force. They hyped up an event that took place previously, the sinking of the Lusitania. You see that Lusitanian ship that was sunk, an American ship. Look at this headline in the New York Times, which is a Rothschild-controlled newspaper at that point in history, right? So the very important media, most influential newspaper in America, starts hyping up the American people in favor of Britain. Look at this hysterical headline. Lusitania sunk by a submarine, probably 1,260 dead, twice torpedoed off Irish coast, sinks in 15 minutes. Captain Turner say Froman and Vanderbilt missing. Washington believes that a grave crisis is at hand. So the hysteria is starting, right? Although this article goes to 1915, the hysteria is really blown overboard by 1917, after the Balfour Declaration, in 1918. Of course, by 1919, we know Germany is finally defeated. America's joined the war. The American people have turned against Germany. Germany was turned into the pariah state of the world. Everybody hates Germans, and Germany goes down. And for a few decades, the idea of Israel is, you see now what is happening is, during the First World War, England takes full charge. After winning the war in Europe, they actually take charge of the old Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire had stood on the side of Germany. And so they lost a lot of their lands. One of the lands which the Ottoman Empire had to give up after the First World War was the land of Palestine. And the land of Palestine, which was a nation within the Ottoman Empire, now became a British protectorate. So the British received a mandate, what they call a mandate, to oversee Palestine. And the idea was to bring Palestine to independence as a new nation. Because nationalism, remember, still very much the guiding philosophy. So now, over the years, between 1919, when the war is won in favor of Britain, and the 1940s, 50s, you have the slow resettlement of Jewish people, or Israelite or Hebrew people from Europe, from the ghettos, shipping them over the Mediterranean into Palestine. So the slow immigration process, or not the immigration process of Jewish people from Europe to Palestine starts after the First World War. There wasn't no Jews in Palestine. Remember, Palestine was a multicultural place with Jews and Christians, but the Jews were maybe 10%, 5% of Palestine. But as the decades went by, 1920, 1930, the Jewish people became a greater and greater percentage of the Palestinian people. And it finally, the World War II comes, and World War II really is some form of a continuation of World War I, because it is the same problem, the same Germany versus England. It's not a completely new war. It's maybe the second war between Germany and Britain, because Germany re-emerges as a powerful country. But in the 30s, under Adolf Hitler, Germany re-emerges as a very powerful nation, using still the same nationalist ideas, German nationalism, as its guiding force, as the rallying cry, but now being very anti-Jewish. Why? Because the Jewish people had supported England and America, the bankers. And so Germany was angry with the Jewish people when it re-emerged in the 1930s. And there was clearly discrimination against the Jewish people of Germany. In fact, they confiscated much of the wealth of Jewish people. And it increased, it energized the emigration of Jews from Germany. And so the Jews were leaving Europe in droves because Germany had really control over large parts of Europe as the war progressed. And so the Jews were filling up Palestine. And I'm not going to go into the Second World War, but let me say that 3 years after the end of the Second World War, in 1948, you see now what has happened is now that the Jewish bankers, or the Zionist bankers, the Rothschild family, had now supported England through 2 wars. World War I, the media establishment got America involved. World War II, they got America involved again. They defeated Germany for a second time. And now the time was up. In 1948, the new United Nations that was established by essentially the people who won the Second World War, Britain, America, France, they were really the founding members of the United Nations. Russia also. They came together and they decided, the top brass in the UN decided, listen, these guys, they've done enough for us now, the Jewish bankers. They've funded us in 2 wars. They gave us victory over Germany. Listen, guys, time up. We've got this Balfour Declaration here, which we gave them the promise. As the UN founding members, we're going to promote this idea in the United Nations. And the United Nations is not a democracy, people. If you think the UN is a democracy, then you've got a serious problem with your understanding. The UN is a dictatorship where 3 countries, Britain, France, and America, really dictate matters in the UN. The other permanent member is Russia. They are there, but they are sort of ostracized and negatively presented at all times. And China the same. So the 3 real big boys within the UN decided in 1948 that it's time up, we're going to give the Jews Israel. And they voted. They created a vote in the United Nations. The Arab nations all voted against it, but of course, the winners of the Second World War were the superpowers of the time. And they gave the go-ahead. And they voted in favor of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And so I hope it's been an hour long. I've given you a good background as to the establishment of the State of Israel. What were the forces of nationalism in Europe that goes back 200 years to the 1790s? The idea of Napoleon to liberate the ghettos of Europe, the value system of the Jewish bankers, which differed from the religious, cultural value system of the Christians and catapulted them to become the most powerful financial power in Europe, how they spread their power through all the main cities, how they used that power to support England in 2 wars and against Germany, and how they got repayment through the gift of the Palestinian people's land being gifted to them in 1948. And 1948 is really the terrible year in which the State of Israel is declared by the United Nations, and it is also the year in which the Jewish settlers in Israel, those millions of people who had come from Europe, white people of Europe, go on the rampage. And you can read it, this is not me making this up, go on the rampage and clear the towns and the villages of Palestinians and resettle themselves in the houses and in the farms and in the villages of Palestinian people, and send 5 million, 6 million Palestinians running across the border into neighboring countries like Jordan and Lebanon, where they had to run for their lives. Some of those people still have the houses, the keys of their houses there. But that is the story of how the West, how Britain, the Anglo-Saxon West, is in bed with the great banking power of the world. And that power, which Imran Hussein refers to as Gog and Magog, the two partners, the Jewish banking fraternity, the Rothschilds, and all their related companies. Like, for example, in South Africa, the mining industry is really an offshoot of that same European power. The mines of South Africa, the mineral wealth of South Africa is really controlled by that same power. Now, I'm not making this up. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is Wikipedia. I've given you Wikipedia information here. This is history. And do not let anyone tell you this is anti-Semitism and this is conspiracy theories, the Jews are ruling the world. No. If I say Bill Gates controls Microsoft, I'm not being a anti-Semite, used to control Microsoft. When I say that, Google is the most powerful IT company in the world, and I say General Electric is the most powerful company, electronics, military, armaments company. If I say to you Boeing is the most powerful aviation company in the world, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm telling you the truth. The most powerful banking company in the world is the Rothschild banks. In South Africa, for example, we've got two of the four major banks seeded by Rothschild capital and still very, very closely tied to the Rothschild fraternity. So that power merged with the military, cultural power of Britain and America really forms the controlling force on the planet today. They're an extremely powerful force because they have cultural control and they have financial, monetary control of the planet. And even countries like China, they are really in connection. They're connected to that power. They're not really independent, if I must say so. So I think I've spoken quite long enough. I hope this is a good background for those of you who does not have this kind of background, but I've given you a clear, honest, factual background of the history of the state of Israel. Thank you, and I hope it does give you a better understanding of present-day politics.